Hey, Kath.
Hey, Trace.
How's it going?
It's going well. Happy New Year. How are you?
Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to all of our beloved listeners and fans as
Yes.
well.
Yes. I like the idea of having fans.
Yeah,
I want to be like one of those horrible people, and just be like my fans, my
my
fans.
fans.
My fans.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Oh my god, Zoolander.
Oh, so one of my favorite movies. I love
Oh, really?
Zoolander. I love it's so
The
funny.
Derek Zoolander of ghosts.
I love Zoolander, and, like, I was thinking about this the other day. It's really funny, like, I have a brother who is a, like, financial he's like a wizard, and he's, like, really successful and a really smart guy, and, he's got a law degree, and he's a CPA, and he's, blah, 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 and his favorite movie is Step Brothers. So it's like no amount, it's like you can't tell, like I'm a historian. I love I'm passionate about history. I'm passionate about science, and I love Zoolander. You can't tell. You think it would be
Oh
like
my
Remains
god.
of the Day or something. Nope, it's Zoolander.
Only intellectually moved.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
No, Step Brothers
oh,
is
well,
a family favorite.
I like somebody was telling somebody I don't even remember how we got into it because you and I both know I don't know what I'm doing with my time, but I don't watch a lot of TV, and I was
Right.
like, "Oh, I'd be okay with, like, removing the TV," and people think that's, like, crazy. But, I was like, "But, I watch a show here and there," and they were like, "Well, what do you watch?" I'm like, like South Park, and it was just this
I
weird
would never have guessed that, though. I would never have guessed that. Cause like,
it's
for
like
me,
The Gilded Age
yeah,
and
yeah,
South
yeah, yeah,
Park.
yeah. I would have been like, for me, it's Below Deck, you know, um, and Hell's Kitchen. I watched
Okay.
Hell's Kitchen every season, and I think there's like 24 seasons.
And unfortunately, it's about cooking and not
Yes,
about something spooky.
yes. Well, he's pretty scary. And it's a competition, and it's just, to me it's just like they can make anything exciting. You know what I mean? Where it's
Yeah.
like, oh my god, he's chopping the onions the wrong way. Oh my god, like you can just. I love that, and I love like Halloween baking
Oh,
competitions and stuff like that,
absolutely.
which is always so funny to me because number one, it's like, how in the hell do they do that? Like, what they're
No
able
pun
to do is
intended.
amazing. But by the end of the season, you're like, well, I mean, the eclair was not what they thought it was going to be. Like you become this expert.
Oh my god.
Well, although it is no Zoolander. It is no Zoolander.
It really, really. So, Kathy, as much as I would love to talk about our favorite shows and all the contradictions about each of us, I'm curious, I must say, about the topic for tonight.
So I was thinking about I was thinking about artifacts in
Ooh,
the museum, and because somebody had asked me, like, What's your favorite artifact?" And it's like, oh well, I don't really have a favorite, but I do.
oh, wow.
And I have a couple of favorites, and the reasons are, different. Like, it's always related to the stories, and it's rarely related to activity, but it's related to the story or like the continuity of it. And
Okay.
so, one of my all-time favorite artifacts, that is in the Paranormal Museum in Asbury Park, New Jersey, is, I like to call it the DNA of a ghost story. And
Ooh,
it's a very simple thing. It's like, if you were just walking past it, and someone wasn't contextualizing it, you'd be like, oh, what is that? It looks like a branch from a tree. And it is. It's a branch from a tree. But it comes from a place in Louisiana called the Myrtles Plantation. And the Myrtles
mm.
Plantation is one of those amazing historic haunts.
And the
And
most haunted place in the United States, so I hear, is that accurate?
you mean the Myrtles
And
Plantation?
Myrtles, yeah.
I'm sure they say it is,
I think that I'm sure someone has actually said, "Is
Oh,
the
every
most
no,
haunted location."
there, yeah, and it's been on. I mean, the reason why I've been there, I've stayed there.
Oh my god.
It's very, it's an inn.
Yeah.
Um, it's really an interesting place, but the reason why I find it so kind of interesting and almost nostalgic is that it was haunted before, people were really interested in paranormal research, and before you had, like 50 or 60 ghost hunting teens and, teams in every town. So this is a story that I heard about like when I was reading Fate magazine. You know what I mean?
Oh,
These are
wow.
stories that predate kind of the advent of, the most recent round of paranormal interest. And it's not usual. There's cycles of people being interested in paranormal research and in psychic phenomena and spiritualism and things like that. But no, it's never been in investigations before. So people have been interested in spiritualism. People have been interested in communicating with the dead and things like that. But this is the first time you've had people saying, "Hey, I'm going to go buy this equipment. I'm going to run around in the woods. I'm going to get a black T-shirt. I'm going to do these different things." But the Myrtles Plantation is one of those really historical places, and it's not just because the place itself is historical, but the haunting is historical. So when I first opened up the Paranormal Museum in, I think I actually sent a request out in like 2008. I asked them for something that I could present in the museum, so that people could learn more about this historical haunting. And they sent me a cutting from the Oleander tree. That is
Oh, wow.
how the ghost story starts. So I thought I would talk about not just the Myrtles Plantation and the Myrtles haunting, but kind of how people arrive at these stories, and how and whether or not the truth of the story matters as much as kind of the totality of it. So that's what I thought we'd talk about today.
And can you promise to also let our listeners and me know, what it was like to stay there,
Oh
and did
yeah,
you
sure.
experience anything?
hmm well, we'll get to that. We'll get to
Yeah?
that.
Okay,
I go
excited.
I go to a lot of places, and my level for having an experience is kind of high. The bar is kind of high. It is a place I would go back to though. Like
Okay.
it was, and it is a place that I highly recommend people whether they're interested in paranormal or history or whatever it is. It's a really remarkable place, and I think they should visit it. And it's not New Orleans. It is in Louisiana, but it is not New Orleans.
Yes.
There are other parts of Louisiana that are not necessarily New Orleans.
Oh,
So, um, people go to places that are described as haunted for lots of different reasons. Some people go because they're drawn by history, some because the place has a reputation, and a lot of people arrive skeptical. They get dragged there. People arrive curious, and others just want to see a place that has accumulated stories over time. A ghost story does not begin with the visit itself, it begins before you get there. And it begins when something kind of registers in the space, and that can take many different forms. Um, a lot of times, it's a direct paranormal experience. In other words, the people that are living there or the people that are spending time there start having experiences. We call them paranormal experiences now, but people might have just said it was something strange. They might have heard footsteps. They might have had sounds that were surrounding them that they couldn't determine a source. Maybe they saw a figure that doesn't belong or had a physical sensation that couldn't be explained by the environment. And other times, it's the history of the place itself. Sometimes things happen in a place that are so revelatory or so important or so dark that they just kind of leave a mark. And when people are in that space, especially a place that may have a heavy history of violence or dark history, people feel it, and when they feel it, it leaves them open to an impression of a haunting. And so before the ghost stories even start, they start when people are having experiences. We like we like to think that sometimes it history leads to the story, but a lot of times the story leads to us learning about the history. So people have experiences, people have sensations, and then it leads them to kind of seek out what the history of a place is. And the Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana, meets both of those conditions. It is a place that has dark history, and it is a place that has experienced a ton of phenomena. For decades, visitors, staff, overnight guests have reported seeing figures, hearing voices, having a sense of being watched, or encountering movements where there aren't people that are present. They come from people with lots of different expectations, people who came there because the place was haunted, and people who had no idea that the place was haunted. Skeptics, paranormal investigators, people who came because they wanted to know about the architecture or the history of the location. And these people have often left with a feeling of being unsettled or having had a strange experience, or they've reached out to the owners and the people who um, uh, the people who run the space, saying, I had these experiences and I don't know what they are. And in fact, they keep a list and a log of all of those experiences, and they have for almost 50 years. So the place has been around a lot longer than that, but it's been operating as an inn for almost 50 years. The documented history of the site is very dark. It's a place of forced enslavement, illness, lots of different types of dark death that shaped daily life there for generations and for centuries. In places like the Myrtles, the experiences and the history, they reinforce one another. When something is felt or observed, people look for explanation. Narrative often forms afterwards, not as the invention, but as as an attempt to organize what the place produces, to make things make sense, to explain the phenomena that people are experiencing. The story that most people now associate with the Myrtles did not create the activity, but it gave it shape, right? The Myrtles Plantation was built in 1796. Over the 19th century, it passed through several owners and, like most plantation properties of its era, relied heavily on enslaved labor. It was not simply a residence, it was a controlled environment where work, punishment, illness, intimacy, and surveillance occurred simultaneously. Enslaved people lived and labored there under constant threat. And they were isolated too. That's an important thing about the plantation system. Was in oftentimes, especially in a place like Louisiana, where you kind of have a river plantation system. The people of the plantation would have been aware that there were other plantations, but they were very limited as far as their knowledge of the outside world. So it wasn't like, oh, I didn't get the news today. They might not be aware that 6 or 7 or 10 or 15 miles down the road, there was another plantation, because they would have been kept in isolation. Now they may be aware of it, because there would be some people would be able to interact, but this idea that people were on plantations, and slaves had networks of information. It's not always the case. There were systems in place to keep enslaved people separate from one another, and keep the information of one another separate, because it was just safer for the overseers, and safer for the slave owners, if they kept these people essentially in the dark, and kept them, without knowing that there were other people like them close by. Enslaved people lived and labored, and they were under constant threat. There were disease outbreaks. Childhood death was very routine, and not just in to the enslaved people, but to the master class as well. And loss was not an interruption of daily life; it was just embedded in it. So the idea of people dying was just part of the day to day. Much of its history is fragmentary. Enslaved people appear in records, but primarily as property. So you don't have a whole lot of marriage records, records of you don't have any kind of record of someone voting, obviously, because an enslaved person wasn't a person. So they didn't go through these kind of structural things that other people, they weren't on the tax records, and information about them would have been only in their position as somebody else's property. So Kathy Kelly wouldn't have records that pertained to Kathy Kelly. Kathy Kelly would only be mentioned as being owned by someone else, as the property of somebody else. And it's hard for us to really understand that or really think about that. But these people were not considered actually people. So
It's
so
horrendous.
they're not in the historic record. They're not there. So generally speaking, the only kind of records that you're going to have are colloquial records or family records, and a lot of that is going to be an oral tradition. So you're not going to find a lot of records of that written down. They are primarily property. They're bought, they're sold, they're inherited, they're punished. Their interior lives, their relationships, their fears, their joys, their suffering, they're largely absent from any kind of official documentation. You don't see diaries. And that absence doesn't indicate that they were peaceful or quiet or that they were stable. It's just that they were erased. And this matters because places that are shaped by cumulative trauma often generate experiences that kind of resist a neat explanation. And when you don't have a record to explain that, you kind of have to look into kind of the broader um, context of what was going on in society. The Myrtles does not behave like a site tied to just one defining event. It was generations and generations of this. The reported activity does not resemble a single tragedy replaying itself. It's layered, it's persistent, and it's interactive and responsive. So the idea that there's just one story that's causing this is not really. It doesn't bear out by the experiences that people have, but you understand why people are looking for one story to explain it, right? Because
Right.
it gives us context. So, reports from guests and staff describe full body apparitions seen both inside and outside the house, sounds that follow movement, sensations of being watched, which is the most common paranormal phenomenon reported, people feeling like they're being followed, disturbances that appear to occur in response to a human presence. In other words, things that are reacting to guests. Some people describe children's voices or laughter. That's very common. Others describe a woman seen near the exterior of the house rather than in the interior rooms. And these descriptions occur across decades, regardless of who's owning the place or how the place is being used, and across people who didn't arrive primed with the same expectations. So, like, even though we know of the Myrtles as a famous haunted place, if you went there in 1970, you you wouldn't have. It just wouldn't have been famous in that way. And even in the 80s and the early 90s, it wouldn't have been that way unless you were specifically looking for it. But the repetition is important. Hauntings that persist across generations rarely depend on one witness or one narrative. They give us a pattern. And over time, one story came to dominate the explanation. And that story centers around an enslaved woman who has become known as Chloe. In the commonly repeated legend, Chloe is described as a house slave who worked inside the plantation home. She is said to have been caught listening to a private conversation and punished by having part of her ear cut off.
Oh my
She
god.
hid the injury by wearing a green turban. Seeking revenge, she poisoned a birthday cake using leaves from the oleander plant that was outside. It was a tree. Um, so, a couple of things about who Chloe may have been. Um, Chloe was if Chloe was an enslaved person, it might just be a name that we've kind of assigned to a character or figure. Um, if she was a house slave, that would have meant that her life was significantly easier, horrific, but significantly easier
Like,
than
less
the
horrific than if
less
she
horrific.
wasn't. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, than a field slave. So she would have had she would have had more food, she would have had she would have had a different way, different place to sleep. She wouldn't have had backbreaking labor outside. She would have just had a horrible labor inside. But what's important to note is that she probably was like 13 to 15 years
Oh
old,
my
right?
god.
So when we're talking about that, we're not talking about a 35-year-old woman, but we're talking about a young person. Um, and the story is a little bit like there's more to the story when the story is told. Um, Sometimes she is referred to as the mistress of the owner of the house. And this is where I have to push back. Okay.
Yeah,
So she's a
100%.
15-year-old enslaved woman, or 15-year-old enslaved girl, without the ability to consent. She was nobody's mistress.
100%.
She was just being consistently raped. and
100%.
and that's something that this is where we start talking about words matter and language matters, and
Yeah,
that's a story that's
100%.
being told is that she was consistently raped. She also would have, because of that situation, she would have been she would have found it very difficult to find a community within her community,
Yeah.
because she would have been because as the unfortunate concubine of the master, or the enslaver, she would have, you know, she would have gotten preferential treatment for certain things that I'm sure she would have traded. Yeah,
Comparatively,
yeah. And no,
comparative.
I mean,
Yeah.
all of it's comparatively,
I
but
mean, I know you know, I'm
no, but
just
I mean, but all of
yeah,
it's comparatively, right? Like if we take into account they're enslaved, they're all
yeah.
enslaved. She maybe gets an extra piece of cake, right? And or she maybe gets but the
A better
trade-off,
room to sleep
well,
in.
yeah, but probably not, but
Yeah,
the trade-off is she's getting raped, so
yeah,
I mean, at the end of
100%.
the day, she's probably like, you know what, take that, extra biscuit.
Yeah.
I'll take the piece of not being raped. And so other people will perceive her as receiving preferential treatment, whereas she's really just receiving horrific attention that she probably doesn't want. But she's also a house enslaved person, which is seen as someone who's already privileged within this very underprivileged community. And so she's not fitting comfortably anyplace. So in her story, right? So there's no record of an enslaved young woman named Chloe. There's no documentation for her. So she's described as a house slave. She worked inside the plantation home. She's said to have been caught listening to a private conversation and punished by having part of her ear cut off. And that's something that would have happened. That's something that would have
Lord.
been common to happen. She hid the injury by wearing. She was known to wear a green turban. And in seeking revenge, and this is a little bit. There's several different stories, but some say in seeking revenge, she poisoned a birthday cake using leaves from the oleander plant, which is outside. And two of the master's children died. Chloe was then executed by other enslaved people, either out of fear of retaliation or as punishment for her actions. After her death, her spirit remained on the property along with the spirits of the children.
Mm.
So the story is complete. It's not the total story, but that's the gist of it. It provides motive, violence, consequence, and continuity, and it explains why children are seen as well. Because remember, people are hearing kids' voices, and they're hearing laughter, and it explains why a woman in green is described. And it offers emotional closure in the form of cause and effect. So we're having these experiences. Here's a story that kind of explains the whole thing. It's also not supported by any historical documentation. There's no plantation or parish records that confirm that that anyone named Chloe or described similar to how Chloe is described. There's no contemporary accounts of poisoning. The children most often associated with the legend are documented as having died of yellow fever. So there were children that died, and they
Yeah,
died of
which
yellow
there would
fever.
have been, right.
Yeah. Well, no, but there's specifically from the
Those 2.
time period,
Okay.
there were two children that died of yellow fever, which is a disease, especially in New Orleans, that killed thousands of children in Louisiana, excuse me, in the 19th century. Parish records family correspondence, and legal documents don't support the execution as described in the story. But of course, it wouldn't, right? The sheriff
Right.
wasn't coming out saying, "Oh, to just string up, this enslaved person." So, uh, to me, the absence of evidence is no way indicative of the fact that
What
something wouldn't didn't
right,
happen, right? There's,
right,
um, so this has been addressed directly by people who have lived and studied in the Myrtles, including Frances Kermeen, who resided there for years, and Carolyn Morrow Long, a former owner who conducted extensive archival research. She was a historian. She both documented repeated unexplained experiences at the property, and both also stated clearly that the poisoning narrative does not align with the historical record. So, in other words, they're like, listen, we get it. There's no evidence of this. But the historical record is incomplete. And both of these women who did extensive research and lived in it and documented so many different experiences, neither of them dismissed the activity. Neither of them. They absolutely, this activity is happening. And that distinction matters. So the absence of evidence for the story does not correspond to an absence of experience. Reports of activity, they don't diminish when the legend is questioned. So it doesn't stop when people are like, "Wait a second, there's nobody named Chloe." People still wake up and say, "Hey, somebody, walked into my room." And the experiences persist. So that suggests that the narrative is not the source of the experiences, but one of several attempts to explain it. So we have this narrative, but that's not what's causing the experiences. The
right.
experiences are leading to the narrative. So, to understand why this explanation is formed, it's necessary to kind of examine what the legend assumes without stating it directly. So, Chloe is described as a house slave. We already talked about that. They were typically young, right? Because they have to be attractive, right? They're not just chosen for youth. They're chosen because maybe they have the ability to be taught to read, and you might have a person who wants to be read to. So, an enslaver is going to choose an attractive, someone that they consider to be attractive, pliable, easy to educate, and easy to control. So they were often adolescents or barely past childhood. And enslaved girls placed in domestic service were selected for obedience and manageability, and their labor placed them in private spaces, private
Mm,
hours, and in intimate proximity to the enslaver and his family. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women and girls by enslavers was systemic. This is
yeah,
something we cannot
yeah.
deny. We
No, of
can't have
course not.
blinders to this. This is,
No.
I mean, come on, it required no consent and carried no legal consequence. Enslaved women had no protection against it. A teenage girl working inside the house would have been especially vulnerable. There was no way to be protected. Nothing. There's nothing you could do that could be protected. If Chloe existed in any form resembling the legend, it is historically plausible that she was very young. She worked inside the house and was sexually exploited by the enslaver. This does not rely on folklore. It reflects documented plantation realities throughout the American South. We know this to have
Yeah,
occurred.
100%.
What the legend rarely addresses is what happened when that exploitation ended. So, sexual access to enslaved women was often temporary, right? It's just scratching an itch. She's the person I'm going to abuse today. Favor shifted, interest waned, and when it did, consequences could follow very quickly. House placement was conditional. A young woman who lost favor could be reassigned to field labor. And to give you an idea, in the late 19th century, no, excuse me, in the late 18th century, in plantations, specifically in Louisiana, the life expectancy of enslaved people was about 26 years of age,
Oh my god.
right? 23 in Jamaica in sugar plantations.
Oh my
So,
god.
there wasn't a whole lot of, when you put out to work in the field, it was cheaper to get a new slave than it was to care for the one that you had.
Oh my god.
So it was horrific. It was horrific. So, field labor was not a neutral reassignment. Field labor was physically punishing, dangerous, and was essentially fatal. It involved longer hours, harsher disciplines, and greater exposure to injury and illness. And for someone who had become accustomed to indoor labor, the transition would be devastating. And remember, like we said, she wouldn't be welcome. There was a social cost. Enslaved women who had been sexually exploited were often isolated within the enslaved communities, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because exploitation distorted power dynamics and placed others at risk. A woman who had been singled out by the enslaver could be viewed with suspicion or resentment. The legend also assumes something else that is rarely stated plainly. Chloe's continued presence in the house would not have depended solely on the enslaver, it would have depended on his wife, who is not blind, who would have known who she was. In plantation households, the mistress was the enslaver's wife. While she did not possess independent legal authority, she exercised daily control over domestic enslaved people. She assigned labor, regulated access to food and clothing, controlled sleeping arrangements, and often administered punishment. An enslaved woman who had been sexually exploited by the enslaver would have occupied an extremely precarious position in relation to his wife. The enslavers' wives were often aware of these abuses, but lacked power or willingness to confront their husbands directly. And that anger, humiliation, resentment was frequently redirected toward the enslaved woman. Survival required constant negotiation. Remaining inside the house required deference, usefulness, and invisibility. Any perception of favor, resentment, or visibility could result in punishment or reassignment to the fields. Seen through this lens, the poisoning story functions less as a sudden act of revenge and more as a compressed narrative that converts prolonged fear, instability, and impending loss into a single dramatic act. In other words, you know, if this was the case, Chloe was the Chloe person, the person we have assigned the name Chloe. It was unlikely that she baked this cake to punish. This 14-year-old girl did not bake a cake to punish this lover. That she had lost the attention of. She was probably desperately trying to make herself useful to a woman who despised her and yet had complete power over her. She was really trapped. I mean, in a system that enslaved her, she was then trapped. Like there was no place for her to hide. Um,
I'm just thinking even like, you know, for argument's sake, I'm sure there were times when it was known that maybe somebody did die of yellow fever, but it was a way to also is an opportunity to scapegoat somebody and get them removed from
oh
your
yeah,
site, and it's just freaking horrendous.
and just remember too, the wife didn't have to explain it. Now, while she was being abused by the husband, she was protected. But when he had moved on to somebody else, she was no longer protected from his wife. So he additionally he didn't want her around. Like he wasn't looking at her with any kind of fear. If anything, it may be contempt. If there was even an awareness, because this type of relationship did not have an emotional component to it.
No, I mean, they were
It was just about
dehumanized.
power. It was just power. So the haunting does not require that the poisoning, as described, is real. The conditions attributed to Chloe were real, whether there was a person named Chloe or not. Sexual exploitation, constant surveillance, fear of reassignment, and social isolation were common realities for enslaved women inside plantation homes. Those experiences did not resolve cleanly. They were absorbed into the place. And remember, we're talking about hundreds of years of this. So so, one of the reasons why the Myrtles Plantation continues to be taken seriously as a paranormal site is that its owners did not rely on rumor or spectacle when confronted with anomalous material. When evidence surfaced, it was examined deliberately and with professional assistance. So, in the early 90s, there's a photo. So the stories are out there. Interestingly enough, there's a couple of women that end up owning the Myrtles Plantation in the late 70s all the way to the 90s. And they have this love affair with this building and with understanding the building. And this is river country Louisiana. So the families of the enslaved people, so they're still living in the plantation area, right? So they're still there. So these stories are not, these are not just stories like someone bought this house and was like, oh, I heard of this ghost story, and these are stories that are handed down generation to generation, by people who are direct blood relatives to the people that the stories are about. And then you have these two women that own this building consecutively, and both of them are like, hey, people are telling me these stories, and they dig deep into the history of it, but they also don't just turn their back on the experiences that people have. So they're not just writing down the stories, but they're marketing this building. They're not marketing it as a paranormal site. They're marketing it as trying to turn it into a B&B, trying to turn it into a place for their families to live. And in a part of in a part of the country that is only beginning to kind of be a tourist location in the 90s. And in the 1990s, there is a photograph taken of the Myrtles Plantation. It's one of the most famous haunted photographs ever taken. So it is, and we'll put it in the show notes, or we'll at
Great.
least put a link to it. Um, and it is a marketing photo that was taken. So there was a photographer that came out, and the photographer, professional photographer, is taking marketing shots to be used in a pamphlet. Right? They're gonna create these marketing, and it's gonna be used in in different advertising opportunities. And so they take a picture of the front of the plantation house, and you see you see this beautiful house, and then off along the side to the right, if you're looking at the house to the right, there's a second house, or a second building that's there, and it's all got these clapboard siding on it. And there is the figure of what appears to be a woman, and she has something across her head. So she's standing in a way. She's a slight built woman. She appears to be of African descent. She has some kind of a turban on her head, and she's very substantially there. But when you look more closely at the photo, you realize that you can see the clapboard siding through the figure. Now, this is not digital photography. This
Right.
is this is somebody taking a photograph. And this is not 1912 where people have to stand there for, 60 seconds for a photograph, where someone could be standing there and then move.
Right.
You're talking about a professional photographer who's taking a picture using a fairly instant, photography. So they see this picture. It wasn't noticed until they developed. Nobody saw her there. There was nobody that looked like her that was working on the place at the time. And so the figure was noticed only when they developed the film. And she's on the negative as well. So it was it was a it was a shocking photo because it matched the descriptions that people had reported seeing. And so the people who owned the Myrtles Plantation actually sent it to, it's the early 90s, so it was just the beginning of graphic design, the kind of computerized graphic design. So they sent it to a graphic designer who said there didn't appear to be any kind of manipulation. There didn't appear to be anything that they couldn't explain how it was there. And they also sent the negatives to an attorney who then had the photograph investigated by a photographer who also said the same thing. Essentially said it's on the negative. So whatever it is, it was there, right? Um, you know, we can look at that and take from that what we will. What I take from that is they didn't know what it was, and they wanted to know what it was. So to me, it doesn't explain, it doesn't say that this is a ghost, but what it does say is that the people who were taking uh owned this place were taking seriously the phenomena that was experienced, because they absolutely believed, they were like, I think we got it, let's do our due diligence and do everything that we can. And I think you can go to their website. I think the report, they actually sent me a copy of the report. So I have a
Oh,
copy of
wow.
the report. I wish I could put my hands on it. It's someplace. But I do think you can see it on their website as well.
Okay.
So according to the owners, the analysis found no evidence that the figure had been digitally added or artificially altered, which at the time would have been the
Yeah.
very early days of a digital manipulation. The lighting, the grain, structure, and the integrity of the image were consistent throughout. The investigators did not claim that the photograph proved a ghost, but they concluded that it showed no obvious signs of fraud or compositing. And so the photograph was treated as unresolved rather than definitive. And as I like to say, it's evidence, it's not proof. Its significant lies in the recognition rather than in its surprise. Witnesses had described seeing a woman near the exterior of the house for decades before the photograph existed. The image did not invent the figure; it just kind of aligned with what people were saying that they were seeing. So when the photo was taken and then they saw it, they're like, "That's what people say they see." And that brings us now to the element that kind of is why we're talking about this. At the Paranormal Museum, there's a cutting from the oleander tree. And the oleander tree is in the crux of the story. Chloe decides that she's going to bake this cake. And she's going to bake the cake. There's the main reason that people think she baked the cake was that not out of revenge, but she wanted to make the kids sick so that she could nurse them back to health. And she could then be seen by the mistress of the house as being very important and very
Useful and
skillful and useful, which sounds like something a 15-year-old would think would
or
work, right?
again, 13,
You
14,
know,
15-year-old.
20, you know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
desperate, someone who's desperate. So she knows Oleander, is obviously deadly. And so she puts it in the cake. And the idea is that, she put too much in and the kids become extremely sick. And she's not able to nurse them back to health and they end up dying. Um,
And the wife did not have the cake and die. I couldn't remember if the
I
wife
mean,
had
it
died
depends
in
on
that
the
story or not.
story. I mean, it
Okay.
depends on the story. Like these are details that it's like, I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard it both ways. I've also heard that, like, and listen, there's murders that do take place in the
No, of
Myrtles,
course.
and from the time frame that they're talking about, there were two children who died, and the mom did not die of yellow fever. And then there was somebody that was shot and killed on the porch. So
Oh, man.
there's stuff that's happening around this time
Right.
which could very well feed into the story side of it. You know what I mean?
Okay.
But there's a
That's
living
been there for
thing,
so many
and
years,
somebody just walked
generations.
out to it and cut a little piece off and sent it to me, and it's like that DNA, that botanical biological material is part and parcel of one of the most famous ghost stories in the United States. And so it's one of my all-time favorite things. So it doesn't prove that anything happened. But it does represent something like it that's rare, right? In historical hauntings and in hauntings in general, which is this continuity of a living thing, right? Like that tree was there 250 some odd years ago. Most objects associated with haunted sites, they're you know they're inert. They're not, it's a piece of furniture, it's a tool, it's a story, it's architectural, it's a document. They're just remnants of a moment that's past. And even when they're charged with meaning, they're fixed in that time. But a living plant, it's just different. It doesn't belong solely to the past. It continues forward. It's changing, but it's still the same. It's still that tree. Oleander trees have grown on the at the Myrtles Plantation for generations, and they definitely were there during the period of enslavement. They remained as the place exchanged hands. They survived disease outbreaks, renovations, modernization, and the transition of the property into a tourist destination. They were trimmed, propagated, replanted, and the cutting is to me, it's one of the rare cases where you can actually touch something that touched the haunting. It's like it's just to me it's just something to me that's tangible in a way that even artifacts aren't. You know,
Yeah.
um, and this matters because ghost stories tend to attach themselves to things, but like buildings and landscapes, but a tree, it's alive, and it continued to live and grow with us. So obviously Oleander's toxicity hasn't changed. And unfortunately, I do believe that the tree has since died. And I believe it died either from a weather related catastrophe or something with building. I can't remember specifically off the top of my head. Um, so even though even though this cutting doesn't prove that the poisoning took place, it does kind of though it reinforce all of the historical stuff that was happening at the time. You know, it demonstrates the conditions, and it demonstrates like why the legend, you know, did grow up, and the potentiality for the reality. So even though she may not have been named Chloe, the wife might have died. There might have been only one kid. It might have been yellow fever. It might have been all of these things may have been, but the conditions were in place for kind of all of it to be possibly true.
Right.
So, reports of the Myrtles are not limited to one type of experience. They're not in one location, and it's unlikely that it's just one story that people are experiencing. Apparitions are seen inside and out of the house. Sounds are reported in empty rooms and hallways. There's a mirror that, if you take pictures of, people see handprints and face prints on. Physical sensations are described by people who are unaware of specific legends. Although I think you would be hard pressed to not know if you were there at this point. Objects are reported to move or appear where they were not placed. Some guests describe activity that seems responsive rather than random or residual. And that distinction matters because residual hauntings are often described as repetitive or playbacks, tied to a single event. But the Myrtles doesn't seem to behave that way. The activity does not repeat in a fixed pattern. It adapts to whomever's presence is around. It reacts to movement. It appears to notice people. And that responsiveness suggests something ongoing rather than trapped in time. So it's not a replay. Owners and long term residents of the Myrtles have emphasized this difference. Francis Kermeen described activity that occurred during daily life, not just at night or during heightened emotional moments. Doors opened and closed without explanation, casual everyday life stuff. Footsteps were heard when no one was present. Sensations of being watched occurred during ordinary routines. Carolyn Marrow Long approached the site as both an owner and an historian. Her research dismantled popular myths associated with the property while leaving experience themselves intact. In other words, she got into the nitty gritty of it and was just like, there was no specific person named Chloe that we can find, but she didn't doubt the phenomena. She just called into question the actual historical reality of the story. Um, so sometimes pulling the story out can make the haunting seem more legitimate. If you take away the story, if you take away the historical inaccuracies and just say, we don't know if there's Chloe, but we do know that there's still footsteps. We do know, like, people are still experiencing those things. So when the Chloe poisoning narrative is stripped away, what remains is, it's not emptiness. It's a house shaped by systemic exploitation, repeated loss, and unresolved human experiences. The haunting is no longer dependent on a single act of violence, but it becomes structural too, and it then leads you to talking about the totality of the experiences in this place. So you can't debunk the Myrtles Plantation story. It only leads you to more truth. Removing one explanation doesn't remove the experiences, and it only removes your attempt to explain why it's happening. It doesn't change the fact that it's happening. And the oleander cutting that we have kind of reinforces this point. It's not tied to one event. It's tied to this centuries of history. It was there before the legend was formalized, and it's there now. It's been present through multiple interpretations of the site, and its survival kind of mirrors the haunting itself. So to me, at the end of it all, the Myrtles Plantation, and I have been there, and it was I think it's a remarkable place.
Did
Um,
you experience anything?
yeah, well, I
I
stayed in
mean, it
the
sounds like it's so
overseers.
haunted that you couldn't not, you
Yeah,
feel something.
no, I think, well, there's a difference between feeling something and experiencing a haunting.
Okay, okay.
So it's like, I would say that the bar is very low if you if to say, well, yeah, I felt something. Because it's just got an enormous amount of history, and you're just going to feel the history of the place, which is not necessarily related to a haunting. I would also say, you're in a place like this now, and there may be 30 or 40 people there on any given night. Even though they're not
Okay.
staying for the room, even though they're not staying in those rooms,
You're
they're
gonna
there for
hear
dinner. Well, they're there
a
for
lot of
dinner,
noise.
but not. It's not just that, but like they're there for hauntings, right? So their energy is there as well. I stayed in the overseer's cabin, which
Good
was a
lord.
small an out structure. Um, I did do the tour of the house. I had breakfast there, I had lunch there, I had dinner there. Um, I walked the place where she supposedly died. You know, you know me. I never say any place is haunted. I am frustratingly skeptical. But if I would say, yeah, that place is haunted. Yeah, there was something about it. Now, again, do I think it was Chloe? No. Do I think it was do I think it was one specific person? No. Do I think it was generations of abused people and other things as well?
Trauma,
Trauma,
just the
trauma, but
energy of
also
trauma
family
upon trauma upon
and
trauma.
not just the trauma of enslavement, but like the trauma of, like, living out in these areas where, childbirth must have been very difficult, and life just must have, even when
Deadly.
life was easy, it must have been hard. And then to have centuries of people telling that story and being kind of open and inviting of the phenomena. um you know i i th- i, I thought the place, I don't think you could do an investigation in the way it is right now and come away with any kind of physical evidence, just because there's a tourism component to it now. But when you talk to the people that work there, I think they are 100% true believers. They're very charming. The woman that runs it she's remarkable, and she traces her lineage to the degree that she can back to the time period of Chloe's enslavement. She's a woman of African descent. And her children are there, and they know the story, and they embrace the story, and they embrace this history. But if you were to, if I had to choose, and I had to say yes, it's haunted, or no, it's not haunted, I would say, yeah, I think it's haunted. I think there's something to the legend. I think there's something to the phenomena that people experience. And like I said, and that's why it's one of my favorite pieces in the museum, because it's a tangible representation of not only a moment in history, but the continuation of history. So that's it. That's
Yeah,
one of my favorite
100%.
artifacts.
And I'm so glad you're talking about the history as it was, because there is this weird subset now of people who are trying to romanticize,
Mm,
the life of enslaved people, and it's
yeah.
enraging. But, so thank you for actually being accurate. Not that I would think you would, but you know what I'm saying. The
Yeah,
other quick
The
thing.
Sally Hemings kind
Mm,
of thing, right? Where people are like,
yeah,
"Oh,
like
they were in
the like
love." No, they weren't.
yeah, it's like, "No,
Like,
they weren't.
no, she
Sorry."
couldn't consent. No, sorry, that was
Yeah,
rape.
yeah. I wanted to touch base about the idea when you were talking about the tree, and the tree, I'm gonna say, is bearing witness, and yes,
Yeah. Hmm.
more than that, but being a living part of history, and the history obviously changes. History is not a static thing, and this tree is this continuous presence. But I was thinking about, and we can talk more about this another time, but when we were in Gettysburg, and we still haven't really ever done a
Oh yeah.
show on
Hmm.
that, but
Hmm.
there
That's
was
because it
that
was too
one
cold.
area. Oh my god. But there was one area that I walked through, and, like, I stopped, and I remember talked about it, and it's just like it just felt something by this particular grove of trees along this road, and I and you mentioned that something had happened there. I won't go into
Mhm.
detail, but there are people who would say that trees, even though they are living continuous objects, will retain some of that, like,
Memory.
historic
Yeah.
footprint or fingerprint, and,
I
we
think
could do
you're
a whole
right.
episode
Yeah.
on that,
I mean,
about, like, do living things bear witness and hold kind of that record?
um,
And because I'm just thinking actually we can ask Pam when she comes on
yeah.
the show.
Yeah.
I told you that Pam Coronado said she will come
Woot
on the
woot.
show, so
Oh,
we
yeah.
have to
I
schedule
thought, hold
that.
on. Whew, I got the vapors.
She will come on and talk about her psychic detective work, but I vaguely remember, her being in natural settings and putting her hand on a
Oh,
tree
yeah.
and other psychics too, and being like, "This tree
It's like,
has, like,
but to
recorded this incident."
but it's not just recording, it remembers.
Right,
Like
right,
I think, stone tape, you like the stone tape theory where, you have certain types of stones that are just continuously recording data, just like the little crystals in our phone. But trees are living beings, right?
right,
They are living beings and they grow in families and they have DNA and they have
and
root systems
that
and
connects far,
right.
far
So the
below ground
idea,
to
like
other
I
trees.
I always say some of my favorite people are trees. I mean, like I love and I think you know that
I say
about
that
me.
about cats.
Yeah. Well, no, but I mean, I think you kind of know that about me that I love I feel this like incredible affinity for trees, especially old growth trees, because I think that they are so representative of what the human experience is if we stop and actually look at it. And then you realize, well, okay, it's not just representative of the human experience. There's their own experience as well.
Yeah,
I think that our cutting from the Myrtles Plantation oleander tree is it it's one of the most meaningful artifacts that we have in the Paranormal Museum to the point that I don't even show the report of the photo. I'm not that impressed by that, and I am impressed by it, but I'm way more impressed by the fact that that tree was still there in 2008, and someone could walk out and cut a piece of one of America's greatest ghost stories. I thought that was remarkable.
well, thank you for, bringing this to our little curious explorers world and community.
Now we're gonna have to
Um,
go, Tracy. We're gonna have to go.
um, but Kat, so nice to see you.
Good to see you.
And yeah, everybody let us know what you think. All right. Well, this has been another episode of Curious Explorers. You know what to do. And until next time, stay curious.
And keep exploring.
Bye for now.
Bye, guys.